Mandisa Mbali is a senior lecturer in historical studies at UCT. Her main research interest is in health policy and activism, considered historically as interrelated phenomena, both transnationally and within South Africa. Dr. Mbali has explored this theme in book chapters and journal articles on AIDS activism and policies, health, gender and sexuality, and the politics of race and ethics in international health. In 2013, she published her scholarly monograph, South African AIDS Activism and Global Health Politics with Palgrave Macmillan, as part of their Global Ethics series. More recently, her work has turned to historically contextualizing the public health politics of COVID-19 in relation to the history of AIDS. And today's talk is titled The End of the Beginning, Historicizing AIDS and COVID-19 in South Africa. Mandisa, the floor is yours.
Okay, I'm going to read the paper. I hope no one minds.
That's
Are we
fine.
at the end of the beginning or the beginning of the end of the global COVID-19 pandemic? As regards the end of the beginning, I would argue it's a strong hypothesis based on available evidence. And what I want to outline today are some unanswered questions I have in relation to epidemiological and biomedical evidence, especially as regards viral diversity and uncertainty about the physiological implications of so-called long COVID. So it might be the case that with the end of the beginning, whole populations has now lived with lockdowns and travel quarantines for some time. A great many people have either had COVID-19 or know people who have had COVID-19, know people who have lost their lives or have lost them, their own lives. Every country has experienced the reality of fears of and responses to the health systems and economic ramifications of the pandemic. The discovery of vaccines effective in warding off serious clinical manifestations of COVID-19 and related deaths have been tested and received regulatory approval. Sadly, however, vaccine access inequity means that while relatively large numbers of people in the global north have now been vaccinated against COVID-19, many in developing countries lack vaccine access. In this paper, I discuss the potential implications of two problems facing historians of medicine who are setting out to write histories of COVID-19 at what I term the end of the beginning of the pandemic. Firstly, I examine the relative influence of societal stigma and modes of transmission on the relative trajectories of early AIDS and COVID-19 social science research. Referring to the history of early social science research on AIDS, I also highlight the pitfalls of donor-driven so-called quick and dirty fieldwork. Instead, I highlight the importance of long-term, in-depth research into the social drivers of pandemic diseases such as AIDS and COVID-19. Secondly, I suggest a way in which scholars in the medical humanities can use concepts of biocapital, bioagency, and bioinformationalism to theorize socioeconomic and political aspects of global vaccine apartheid. So to begin with discussing a methodological problem, and I want to do here a comparative analysis of so-called quick and dirty fieldwork in examining AIDS and COVID-19 in early periods of the respective pandemics. So at this early stage of the end of the beginning, for understandable reasons, given the scale of COVID-19 related infections and deaths, historians of medicine have been inundated with media requests to explain the so-called lessons from prior pandemics for COVID-19. Indeed, I myself am having the umpteenth interview with a journalist today, and I know that Howard has also been very busy, sort of with media outreach. So given its airborne mode of transmission, Spanish influenza and severe acute respiratory syndrome have been among the most frequently cited historical parallels. Pessimistically, or perhaps realistically, assuming that we're at the end of the beginning of the COVID-19 pandemic, it may be time for us to gather all histories on the impact of COVID-19 on individuals and or social groups. There's also a theoretical issue I would like to flag, that we need to move beyond the almost exclusive focus on COVID-19 and past pandemics to examine both how patients and communities have interpreted the pandemic in and across the sweep of their lives, and long-term antecedent structural drivers of the pandemic in an African setting. Here, I would argue that we can learn the lessons from the intellectual history of humanities and social science research on how AIDS was socially determined. Comparatively speaking, AIDS and COVID-19 show that infectious diseases, modes of transmission, and societal stigma can shape the different trajectories of social science research around them. To start with a discussion of COVID-19, as we know, it is a virulent airborne infectious disease, which means that in-person COVID-19 research carries several risks, especially among the unvaccinated. There were certain examples of xenophobia and homophobia associated with COVID-19 epidemics in relation to inter alia, its emergence in China and association with homophobia in South Korea in the earlier phases of the COVID-19 pandemic. I would, however, like for us to explore the extent to which the large-scale, society-wide, rapid transmission of the SARS-CoV-2 virus has meant that there has perhaps been a lesser rate of related stigma in comparison with the early AIDS pandemic, especially, I would argue, in South Africa. This is a research question that we must answer. In particular, to return to AIDS. From relatively early on in its history, scientists knew that it was sexually transmitted by bodily fluids, with patterns of transmission mimicking hepatitis B. In the case of social science AIDS research, biologically, on the face of it, the risk of HIV transmission in conducting oral history interviews or engaging in ethnographic research was practically non-existent. However, as several historians of medicine have demonstrated, the sexual mode of HIV transmission and its early association with gay men, sex workers, and people who used injectable narcotics meant that there was a great deal of stigma and discrimination associated with those living with the disease. Here, I'd like to focus on two stigmatized groups, namely Black people and gay men. So AIDS entered South Africa during the late apartheid era, which was defined by racial segregation justified in terms of Calvinist Christianity. Sodomy was illegal, and the infamous 3 men at a party clause forbade more than 2 men to meet for so-called homosexual gatherings. While there were early efforts by gay organizations to educate gay men about the threat posed by AIDS, the landscape of gay organizing was heavily divided along the lines of race. Inasmuch as gay sexual activity organizations, the use of dildos, and the propagation of frank, gay appropriate and empowering sex education were illegal, I would argue that it was extremely ethically and practically difficult to recruit key informants to thoroughly qualitatively study AIDS among gay men in the 1980s. And indeed, if we look at the periodization of a myriad of rich, legal, anthropological, and gender-focused studies of AIDS and gay men, we see that they only began in the transition period. Here, I would like to particularly point to the volume by Cameron Chavissa entitled Defiant Desire, which was published in 1994 as a signature moment in queer studies, including queer history. However, as late as 2006, Basu Reddy and others noted that despite the fact there was already ample research on homosexuality and law and the humanities disciplines, there was what they termed, quote, an absence of homosexuality in the health sciences, public health, and behavioral science literature about AIDS in South Africa. And they went on to argue that, quote, the disparity of focus could be attributed to the inherently conservative influence of funding for large behavioral science research projects and the epidemiology of AIDS in South Africa, of the AIDS epidemic in South Africa, which was predominantly heterosexual. So early anti-apartheid social science, AIDS research and activism was also hindered by the broader politics of race, gender and sexuality in the period. Here, we must note that during the apartheid era, the stigmatization of and efforts to control Black sexuality were key planks of government repression on the grounds of race and gender. In particular, the state feared the Black population would so-called swamp the white population, and so implemented an elaborate and coercive family planning program targeted at Black African women, which included forced and coerced sterilizations and Depo-Provera injections. When so-called heterosexual AIDS did emerge among truck drivers, migrant laborers, and sex workers in the 1980s, events such as the Chamber of Mines' repatriation of 13,000 Malawian miners between 1988 and 1992 did little to foster openness about living with HIV. So moreover, as we can note, early social science studies concerning AIDS among such groups was not always popular in so-called progressive circles. So here I'm referring to a study by scholars at the Sociology of Work program at BITS, alerting the National Union of Mine Workers to the risk of HIV spreading among miners in 88, 89, and their research findings were initially understood by the union as racist and did not significantly impact on its overall policies and programs in the period. And the most politically charged group associated with early cases of AIDS were returning MK cadres. So early HIV-related stigma and discrimination in South Africa dovetailed with xenophobia. And we can also note that it was used by the right-wing Conservative Party to stoke white South Africans' fears around the returning MK so-called terrorists. So one of the things that I would argue is that actually in the early 2000s, there was an AIDS social science research explosion. So I would argue that in relation to AIDS, we can note that I think we might be able to map this on to the peaking of AIDS as the leading cause of death in South Africa. And so many, one of the problems was when this sort of in-depth research, sociocultural research on AIDS started to emerge in the early 2000s, we can note that as late as 2002, Delius and Walker argued that, I want to quote here because it's quite important, the enormous urgency of the issues in tandem with the funding cycles and priorities of donor organizations have tended to promote fairly rapid and sometimes formulaic forms of social science research. This work has yielded important insights, but the complexity of the issues require in-depth and long-term historical and sociological research. This substantive research should also inform and respond to rigorous and large-scale quantitative research. So in the early COVID-19 pandemic era, what are some of the lessons in terms of how public health donor agendas and the stigma related to a disease can shape social science research to alter its course? What I've noted elsewhere in relation to problematic discourses as regards the so-called end of AIDS, techno fixes and celebrity scientists and activists have been emphasized both in the so-called AIDS world and in popular discourse. I would argue that this has been to the detriment of the funding and development of effective societal interventions aimed at tackling the social drivers of persistently high rates of preventable HIV infections and deaths. I would argue that the discovery of COVID-19 vaccines is analogous to the discovery of effective combination ARV therapy, in as much as both prevent needless loss of life and can prevent new infections with, the respective viruses. However, patients need to use medical interventions in order for them to work. Just as COVID-19 vaccines cannot remain in the fridge at the clinic, so must ARVs be prescribed, leave the pharmacy, and be consistently and correctly used by a person living with HIV. Now, obviously, the reasons why people can't or won't take either can only be fully explained through humanities and social science research into hesitancy and denial in relation to these medical interventions. What I'm arguing here is that there needs to be a systematic mapping, both enumeration and comparison, of in-depth, long-term, qualitative humanities research into vaccine hesitancy and denial, and what motivates people to both get vaccinated themselves and to convince others to do so. We also need an analysis of the funding which is being made available by public health donors for in-depth, long-term, qualitative humanities research. My initial hypothesis is that it appears to be inadequate and that we need more funded projects of this nature. So something that we can learn in relation to the intellectual history of the humanities and social science research into HIV/AIDS is that there are serious pitfalls to so-called quick and dirty fieldwork. Moreover, while we have to advance the human right to health, in this instance vaccines, we must also perhaps harness some of the spirit of qualified cultural relativism to understand how people's views of vaccines fit into their life stories, the realities of their living conditions, and their understandings of the world. This will take some time and it will not be able to directly inform public health interventions at this early phase. A vital research ethics issue is the need to conduct research safely. And so one of the problems is that it's often vastly preferable to conduct oral history interviews in person, especially around issues of life, sickness, and death, which are fundamental parts of the dramaturgy of human existence. I'd now like to move on to discussing some conceptual or theoretical issues in relation to the social or pandemic and biological life of the SARS-CoV-2 virus. So COVID-19 vaccines have fundamentally changed the trajectory of the history of the pandemic. Where vaccine rollouts have been available and involved high take-up, serious morbidity and mortality related to disease have plunged. At this juncture, we need to consider debates about the disease ontology of SARS-CoV-2, especially the extent to which it is biologically determined versus socially constructed. Here, I want to argue that in the absence of highly effective treatment for COVID-19, the question of human versus so-called bioagency needs to be teased out in relation to two sets of issues related to the pandemic transnationally considered. Firstly, to what extent does bioagency shape the production of COVID-19 related historical and ethnographic research? So much I could say here, but I cut this from my paper in the interest of time. Secondly, how does bioagency shape pandemic-related global health law and politics and vice versa? So the in-depth longitudinal studies I'm proposing must also be theoretically informed and methodologically rigorous in order for us to obtain systematic understandings of what's preventing the global rollout of COVID-19 vaccines. Here, I want to suggest a few points of departure for possible research questions. As a starting point, I want to expand upon Rajan's notion of biocapital with reference to recent work on bioagency and bioinformationalism. So to begin with a basic question, does a virus live? And if so, how? In virology, a dominant trend has been for viruses to not be defined as living entities. However, this view has important ramifications. As Warwick Anderson has pointed out, simply considering a virus as an alien, which is sort of contracted through the mechanical mode of contact and contamination, can lead to militarized and xenophobic responses to diseases, virally called diseases. Some philosophers of science have argued that when we take a system biological approach to biology, we also need to challenge the distinction between virus as non-life and other organisms as life. Chadha-Revian has also cited Karen Barad as proposing that we use the term interaction, so that is inter-action, instead of interaction, that is interaction as one word, to show that the two forms of agencies, viral and human, are not distinguished before they're encountered, but arise from it. So humans are the main vectors for its proliferation, that is SARS-CoV-2. And they go on to argue, quote, that this makes the virus always and already both natural and human-made. So finally, they make the case for, quote, us to take into consideration the dynamic interactions of humans and other species in historical settings, to think about, quote, how to live humanely in a pandemic. They then talk about how we should consider the social life of humans and its enmeshment in the viral world, such as to enable us to produce a so-called anthropology of the virus. I would argue that one place where bioagency, considering how the viral world shapes human experience and vice versa, may be in evidence with reference to global health law and policy. So, in order to stop the emergence of variants which are better able to evade the immune system and the protection offered by vaccines, it's necessary for there to be globally universal vaccination, as WHO DG Dr. Tedros Adhanom Ghebreyesus has said, quote, no one is safe until everyone everywhere is safe. When we look at global vaccine inequity, a key issue is the need to end long, inflexible patents and to ensure that more affordable copies of the vaccine can be made in developing countries. So reform to global trade law around essential medicines is often justified in terms of what we can term the right to science. That is the right of everyone to benefit from the fruits of scientific knowledge. But this is not the only area where science can be shared. So Jandrik has argued that we must understand SARS-CoV-2 genetic sequencing with reference to bioinformationalism. Here, he's talking about multiple different things. Firstly, in the context of the overwhelming march of the digitization of knowledge, since the late 20th century, biology took a major turn. So, for example, when the human genome was sequenced, Benter argued the so-called analog world of biology was translated into the so-called digital world of the computer. And so Jandrik argues that, quote, in our post-digital age, contagious diseases such as COVID-19 are at the same time biological, they arrive from nature and affect human bodies, social and cultural, they elicit socially and culturally constructive responses, and that he goes on to say that developed within a post-digital context, the world's response to the threat of COVID-19 says a lot about the viral nature of our modernity. He then goes on to talk about the bioinformationist response as applied to the sharing of science. And here I need to condense a great deal of material. So as we've seen, peer-reviewed research publications rapidly became open access from the early phases of the pandemic. Research findings have been made available via preprint servers. Researchers from the early days shared quote interim and final research data relating to the outbreak. However, the sharing of data and preprints did not preempt publication in these journals. So in a big move, Springer Nature made its SARS-CoV-2 and COVID-19 research available for free. So it's been noted by historians of the pandemic and other observers that this new approach to rapid information sharing was unprecedented, and within weeks, scientists had sequenced the viral genome and deciphered the virus's genetic code. Crow has gone on to argue that, quote, when the story of coronavirus, then known as 2019 nCoV, is finally written, it may well become a template for the utopian dream of open science, where research data is shared freely, unrestrained by competition, paywalls, and patents. I want to challenge accounts that imply that COVID-19 has substantially advanced the realization of the right to science, that is scientific knowledge. Instead, I'm thinking to think through the issue of corporate and institutional gatekeeping in pharmaceutical regulation and patenting. I do not want to upset the apple cart here, but it seems to me that this account of so-called open science in relation to the science around SARS-CoV-2 may be a little triumphalist. Is this build construction work interfering with your ability to hear me?
Yes, yes, we can hear you. No, not a problem.
Yes, clearly, Mandisa, clearly.
Clearly, not a problem, yeah.
You can hear me clearly? Okay, great.
Yeah.
Okay, so where were we? So I want to challenge accounts that imply that COVID-19 has substantially advanced the right to the realization of the right to science. Instead, I think we need to think through the issue of corporate and institutional gatekeeping in pharmaceutical regulation, patenting, and production. I do not want to upset the apple cart here, but it seems to me this account of open science in relation to SARS-CoV-2 may be a little triumphalist. While it's laudable that scientists are sharing their research so openly and at such a rapid rate via data sharing, preprints, and rapid peer review, the research on vaccines must go from bench, i.e. laboratories, to bedside, i.e. clinics and vaccination sites. So the vaccines are biologic drugs, also described as living medicines, and cheaper versions made through different mechanisms of action are called biosimilars. And this is an issue that I explored in relation to advocacy around universal access to breast cancer drug trastuzumab for patients that required it in terms of being HER2 positive, having HER2 positive breast cancer. So in terms of the importance of the production of cheaper equivalents of biologic drugs, enter biocapital. In this case, for example, BioNTech, which did the basic research for one of the vaccines, and Pfizer, which manages the production of the vaccine. So in order to understand the long and inflexible patenting of biologics such as COVID-19 vaccines, it's important to examine the socioeconomic nature of biotech companies in the context of contemporary global capitalism. In his book, Biocapital, The Constitution of Post-Genomic Life, Kashak Sundarajan argues that, quote, life sciences represent a new phase of capitalism. He conceptualizes the nexus between biotech and capitalism using the concept of so-called biocapital. Here we can note that biotech companies are most often funded by venture capitalists, and they often become listed companies whose share price is determined by speculation on stock markets, most notably investors on Wall Street. On the international stage, both India and South Africa have argued for a patent waiver for COVID-19 vaccines since October 2020, with the idea being to expand manufacturing capabilities, especially in the global south. More than 100 low-income countries have supported the proposal. One remarkable turn of events was that on the 5th of May 2021, when US President Joe Biden announced support for a patent waiver. However, the UK, Canada, Japan, and Australia have expressed opposition to the patent waiver. WTO Director General Ngozi Okonjo-Iweala has been strongly in support of the proposal, and on 9th of June, talks began. However, these have been moving at a glacial pace. I'm almost done. In the case of biologics, there are complex reasons why producing cheaper versions does not only boil down to patents. A critical issue is also the quality of the manufacturing process, something stringent drug regulatory authorities such as the FDA have to manage. And we saw this in relation to the problems at Emergent Biosolutions Inc. plant in Baltimore earlier this year. Similarly, what we have to note is the Pfizer vaccine is produced in 3 different phases at 3 different factories, namely Chesterfield, Andover, and Kalamazoo, all in the US. Here, I propose we avoid a reductionist view of biology as purely digitized and data-driven these days, because at the production phase, molecular, biological, and biochemical processes have to be managed. While Pfizer has entered into agreement with Biovac and J&J with Aspen Pharmacare, it's my understanding that these are so-called finish and fill products, and I would be intrigued to know about the cost impact of production of COVID-19 from scratch in an African context. Okay, so towards some preliminary conclusions. One, we know from the history of social science research on AIDS that there are pitfalls to donor-driven so-called quick and dirty fieldwork. What we need is long-term, in-depth ethnographic research to answer important questions such as those around vaccine hesitancy. We need to address the applicability of the concept of bioagency to understand the relationships between the virus and humans in shaping the world. 3, we should not be over-celebratory over the concept of so-called open science in biology with reference to bioinformationism. So what I'm arguing here is that biocapital means that there's been resistance to TRIPS waivers for COVID-19 vaccines. And so there's not been tech transfer in terms of the production side of things. Sorry, I leave it there. Quite a dense paper.
Thank you, Mandisa. As you've correctly described your paper, it's quite dense, but I'm sure there's a lot to discuss and a lot to chat about. So just if you could use the hand option, or just turn on your video and ask the question, or just ask the question, however you feel comfortable. Questions and comments. We have a good half an hour. Carla, please go ahead.
Hi, hello everyone. Hi Mandisa, thanks for the paper. Mandisa, I was kind of interested in the point you made about, an analysis of the historiography, that we need this kind of analysis of the historiographies, both of AIDS and, and now as it's unfolding, what is written or how the writings of kind of the responses to COVID are made. And what I was interested in that regard is that, Krundling wrote the first kind of paper that was South African specific in 1987. And by the time he was writing that, he'd made this comment about the historiography of AIDS and HIV, which was very clearly located in the US and the UK. And then, as you say, there was a kind of slow tripling in of stuff in between then, and this explosion in the early 2000s of writing. So I suppose my question is how do we think also, though, about the kind of influences of global politics and local politics on the moments of social science and history and humanities research? Because, in some ways, the responses, Fee and Fox writing in 87, 88 makes sense because of the political context in the UK at the time. So it's restrictive, but not as restrictive. There's a comparison, whereas in South Africa, the I suppose zeitgeist of the late 80s is very different. And again, towards the mid 90s, before the late 80s into the early 90s, there's more of the kind of the hope for the new dawn that's coming up. And so that shifts the thinking and the kind of involvement of the social scientists and humanities people. So I suppose my question is, in thinking through that and the necessity of that, how do we both locate the politics that shape the writing of social sciences and humanities then and now? What would we articulate as the current zeitgeist for social science and humanities researchers in 2021 in South Africa compared to, maybe those writing in the US or the UK or wherever else? So I'm just, it sticks with me, that kind of question of, I think these are important things, but how do we account for that? Or how do we factor that in if we write these historiographies?
Thank you, Carla. Mandisa, Susan has a question. Do you want to take two questions together, and maybe then we'll have another round?
Yeah, perhaps, because I did run a few minutes over.
Okay, no, that's not a problem, not at all. Susan, please go ahead.
Hi, Mandisa. Hi, everyone. Thank you so much it's nice to see you. It's been a long time. Thank you so much for your paper. It really opens up so many questions about the historicity and some of the comparative work and framing around HIV and COVID, which are so distinct and yet have these, fascinating overlaps, the least of which is the fact that they share a common base for the vaccine. So that the current coronavirus vaccine is actually built, at least the J&J vaccine is built on the base, the very material base of the vaccine that was already in process of being made at the Desmond Tutu Center over the past 25, almost 30 years. And so they took the HIV part out and then put the COVID back in. And it's a very interesting kind of metabolic relationship. So that's not my question, though. My question is that the kind of timeliness, fascination of your seminar now, just on the heels of, I'm sure some of you were present at the Vice Chancellor's open discussion around UCT's question around a mandatory vaccine. And what struck me reading the comments, and they were mostly anonymous, so we don't know whether it was, how many people were anonymous, if it was the same person or many people. But in your paper, you talk about vaccine apartheid. And I guess that's an indicator of a kind of political economy, or you're calling it a bio-capital framework in which there's an unequal access to vaccines, flawed public health system, et cetera. But what really fascinated me, which is the counterpoint to that narrative, is the increasing sensibility that somehow with mandatory vaccination or forced vaccination, as the case may be, top-down prescriptive vaccine, that there's something about this that harkens back to an apartheid era mandates. And this kept coming up in the chat during the VC's discussion. And so I noted the two very different uses of apartheid as emerging in the context of vaccine logics, and how that might signal something that Carla had raised about a very different zeitgeist. Those of us who are old enough to have been part of the flurry of activism at, in the 1990s with the Treatment Action Campaign and the desire for ARVs, in the streets, at our universities, there was, wide social movements that have been well documented, by yourself and other historians. I see Howard here and Carla. But, is there a different kind of zeitgeist that's framing a kind of contest between individual rights and what's being perceived as the freedom not to take vaccines? Is there a sea change in a kind of, I don't want to use the word neoliberal anymore, divine help me. So, is there something that's different? And so I'm really curious about the question you raise about the logics of vaccine hesitancy in this moment, and contrasting it to some of the urgency around ARV acquisition at the height of, the protests against Mbeki's rather genocidal politics. Yeah, so that's a complicated question, I know, but I just wanted to try and link it with Carla's kind of long view of the zeitgeist and some of the different uses of apartheid. But great paper, and yeah, have pages of questions. Thanks so much.
Thanks, Susan. Mandisa, if you can respond to the couple of questions, then we'll take another round.
Okay, I'm going to respond briefly, but Susan and Carla and I are very frequently in touch about our research and postgraduate teaching. So I will follow up on some other threads of our discussion one-on-one via email. But I really like the point that both were making about how our political and ethical commitments shape our research and writing on pandemics. Because I was thinking about it this morning when I was driving to campus and thinking back to Paul Farmer and Nancy Shepherd-Hughes's whole point about how, I've got this thing in my head at the moment, I've got a bit of a knot, because I'm like, okay, the cultural relativist posture. So we can't be demeaning to people who have vaccine hesitancy. We have to recognize that there are lots of different cosmologies and spiritual systems of value in South Africa, and meet people where they are, like listen, learn, discuss, hopefully where possible, persuade. But on the other hand, there's kind of an imperative, a human rights imperative, to prevent needless loss of life, and also, for example, health system collapse. So I'm thinking, what are our ethical obligations as historians and anthropologists? Like, how do we meet people where they're at and sensitively gather old histories? But also, is there an element by which we may wish to try to some extent, persuade people to get vaccinated, or at least clarify any questions that people might have? So that knot, I haven't really resolved in my head yet. And what we were talking about with reference to the treatment action campaign, that's one of the things that made me think about this, because I think a lot of us felt like, because I was also involved in AIDS activism, the point wasn't merely to interpret the world, but to change it. So, this sense of not wanting to sit back and be idle bystanders in a massive humanitarian and societal crisis. So I definitely agree with the point that we're not robots, and our ethical and political commitments definitely shape, our writings. There was another thing I wanted to say with reference to the university forum. I was actually finishing up this paper. Unfortunately, I missed it. But what I wanted to say is that there was a whole bunch of stuff that I had to cut, which will go into the final version, around the politics of drug regulatory approval, and also phase 3 clinical trials, because I think that a lot of the public confusion around SARS-CoV-2 vaccines is basically around people not understanding, or it being poorly explained to them, how drugs are tested and approved. But there's a final point I wanted to make with reference to racism and vaccine hesitancy. I think a research question is sort of what the antecedent or backstories are to the myth that the vaccine makes one infertile. Because I think, as with what I argued with reference to, for example, Mbeki's AIDS denialism, there's a long shadow in terms of forced and coerced reproductive health fertility limiting measures among Black South Africans. And I think that we have to historicize those kind of fears. And like I was saying, just not write people off. I mean, anyway, that's my answer.
Thanks, Mandisa. Athambile had a comment. Atha, do you want to just make the comment in person, or are you happy with it being in the chat box? Atha, can you hear me? Anyway, I don't know whether she can hear us or not, but other comments, questions?
Could you please read it aloud to me? And then maybe when she's back online, we can reopen things a little.
She says, thanks for the paper, Mandisa. Really interesting. Mine is just a comment. I have been struck by a whole new vocabulary for the pandemic. Oh, she's having some connectivity issues, but I've been struck by a whole new vocabulary for the pandemic, which helps us understand what is happening, but also constructs our new reality. I think that's a general comment that she has. But other questions, comments? We have 15 minutes. While people are probably, there's a lot. Kala, you want to go? Please go ahead. Yes.
Sorry, I know it's my second round of airtime, but as other people are being quiet, I thought I would make use. Mandisa, just I thought it might be interesting. Natalie Leon and a sociologist whose name has now escaped me are busy doing some really interesting work. They're busy writing it up now on a discussion on vaccine hesitancy that actually extends pre-COVID. So it was part of a much bigger study around vaccine hesitancy for children's vaccines, vaccines for babies and younger and children. And it's been, her and I just chatted briefly about some of the findings. And what is interesting is the commonalities of findings across kind of most identifying markers, but also the kind of quite specific class differences in the responses. So, and this is, I suppose it's a fairly, common, analysis that in some cases it's that people can, choose not to vaccinate because because if something goes wrong, they have enough capital to be able to provide very direct care or get oxygen or whatever the case may be. So there's an interesting kind of thread of narrative around that. But then the converse to that is also people seeing public health interventions as the only time that officials are interested in them. So I think Natalie mentioned, and I'm speaking from memory here, so obviously this needs to be read from its original source, but Natalie mentioned a comment from particularly kind of parents in a rural area in Nigeria talking about the only time the government is interested in us is when they come for our children. So they come and they vaccinate the children, then if we die from starvation, it's fine. So this kind of quite interesting, so these quite complex relationships between class and other identity formations and hesitance or anti-vaccine narratives. So that's just as a flag that it might be interesting to try and get hold of Natalie and I'll try and remember the other person's name to see that. And then just very briefly touching on the idea of, it's been amazing for me, and Susan, you've kind of referred to this, the difference between the beginning of the pandemic when, the big push was to ensure that vaccines were available. Now the vaccines are available, but those who to be vaccinated are less available. And as you said, the idea of apartheid, the calling on apartheid, being used in kind of almost all parts of the argument. So whether it's to get more vaccines in place or as an argument to not be involved in the public health thing. So I don't know, it just strikes me as a very interesting, such a quick flip so quickly between, desperation for vaccines and then vaccines in here and then a resistance or hesitancy towards getting them. So anyway, thanks.
Thanks, Kala. There is a question. Amanda, would you just ask the question in person if possible?
Thanks, Ananda. And sorry, I cannot share my.
That's fine. That's fine.
Face. I should preface this by saying that I'm not saying apartheid cannot be invoked in talking about a different kind of situation. I think it's important that it should be invoked. But I'm just wondering whether there is an easy, unproblematic way in which the word apartheid is used and I'm trying to wrap my head around whether it is accurate in all instances to use that, and in what instances it might sound offensive to the extent that the context of the current situation and the apartheid moment would seem to be different. And to that extent, I'm wondering about its appropriateness in all instances. Thanks.
Thanks, Manda. And I'll just add one question, Mandisa, if you don't mind, then maybe you can take all of them together. This is to build on what I think Manda just said and Susan's question, and I want to probe a little bit more on that front. Just in terms of that, I mean, this question comes from a place where I'm thinking methodologically, what does historicizing achieve in such a context? And while I'm thinking along those lines, I'm thinking about the specificity of this moment as compared to the early 90s moment, which is perhaps has a certain kind of optimism around, or a certain different idea about the state economy, social welfare, etc., and 2020, which has seen an eclipse of that early optimism, or has seen a substantial change. So I'm wondering about. And here, Manda's question, I think what Manda is asking becomes quite important. And I'm a little circumspect about historicizing and leaving the category of culture, untroubled by this act of historicization, where we can actually allow certain kind of conversations to happen, irrespective of their entanglements in different kind of progressive politics or regressive politics. We almost become fearful of actually saying anything, despite our historicizing, by saying that there is a cultural historical baggage to something. So I'm thinking methodologically, especially around the vaccine, it kind of makes me think that it is also a moment after RMF in South Africa, where a certain conversation around indigeneity has gathered a certain momentum, which almost makes us afraid of saying anything against culture. And if reading the political economy of culture becomes almost like an offensive act in itself, which I find quite strange. And that maybe is quite an interesting way could be an interesting clue to thinking about the specificity of the moment and what we do as historians in terms of historicizing. And if you're leaving the category of culture untroubled, I mean, I was looking at Jordan Peterson's show, Trevor Noah's show, where Jordan Peterson goes to these, he was covering this white, anti-vaccine rally. I mean, people are using the same language in certain ways, that this is our culture. So it's kind of it's something maybe to kind of think about. Another thing, this is slightly different. So I was thinking about different comparison, and the air transmission is something which I found quite interesting. Is the fact that I was reading Peter Sloterdijk's Terror from the Air for something else. And he makes a very fascinating argument about how 20th century fundamental change in 20th century, or fundamental technology in 20th century, is a control of air, and that he traces through the rise of of the Air Force, bombing, control of environment right now in many ways. And I was wondering if we can actually think of comparisons which are not necessarily other pandemics, but the technology of governing our surroundings and creating private surroundings. And that the socialization, stigmatization that you're talking about actually speaks to a larger corporatization and colonialization and rule of air, rather than just another pandemic. But I would like to hear your thoughts on that. But thank you for a great paper. Carolyn has a question. Do you want to take Carolyn's question and finish this round? Or maybe
could I take the other ones just very quickly first? Okay. Carla, in the interest of time, could we please again correspond separately and meet separately to discuss your question? Because then I can engage with the other questions. Okay, right. So, Manda, I agree with you that we need to be critical about the ways in which apartheid is invoked, because there are other kinds of rationales. Like, I think that Dr. Tedros's idea of no one being safe anywhere until everyone's safe everywhere might in a way be potentially more powerful, like highlighting the way in which universal vaccination helps global north countries to meet their own national interests. So the extent to which it's kind of selfish to be altruistic in this instance. But I want to unpack a lot more of the racial elements. So I really thank you for that question. Now, Anandaroop, so I like the way, I found it quite provocative what you said, because obviously we're biased, we're historians, okay? And we have various commitments to promoting our discipline and our approach. But I really like what you've said. Like, does history matter in this kind of picture? Can we save lives or contribute to the understanding of society in ways which are going to be helpful? But then the problem is, isn't that kind of like a bit utilitarian and reductionist? Like, in my experience, we can help explain social phenomena in ways that help society to be more humane. So it goes back to what I was saying about our colleague Warwick Anderson and those other two colleagues arguing that if we theorize COVID properly, it can help to combat stigma and discrimination against various groups. And I would add to that about how we can combat vaccine hesitancy. Breathe terror from the air. That's another thing I want to expand on, is the ways in which environmental humanities can help me to understand how bioagency might apply to particularly how global policy is made. And then what you were saying about the specificity of our understanding of culture. A point of departure I've always had is the medical anthropologist who studies China by the name of Judith Thakur, who said that when we look at medical anthropology, two very important elements are phenomenology and political economy. So it's like thick systems of meaning in our lives, but also who gets what in society and who's powerful also shape culture. So I agree with you, we can't be flat. And that's one of my concerns about cultural relativism, right? It's like everybody's got their own box. And if I'm studying a culture that is not my culture, I can't really say anything about that culture. And like it's kind of a flat thing, almost like structural functionalism or something.
Mandisa, Carolyn has a question, and I think this will be one of the last questions, if not the last. Carolyn, please go ahead.
Thanks very much. So Mandisa, thinking about this, your interest in the theorizing and historicizing of COVID and vaccine hesitancy, socially, I suppose, raises the following question for me, and that is, would it be productive for you at the same time to theorize and historicize the dynamics of public discussion? Because it appears that's a kind of key factor that has to be understood in action in order to kind of contribute. I think it would contribute enormously to a whole lot of the things that you're wanting to try and bed down here. And of course, things like the sidestepping in debate or field jumping of issues from one field to another, how the mediatization kicks in, how different discussion communities do, and so on. It seems to me absolutely critical. And there's a great deal of theoretical and historicizing work that has been published in the last 5 years. So I just thought I'd throw that into the discussion. And it really comes out of Carla's point of, as soon as that class issue comes in, it says, you have to then ask the question, who's got access to which part of the public discussion and how does that feature? So, Carla really set me off there. Thanks.
So what I wanted to say is the paper has to be 5,000 words. So what I've strategically decided to do is focus on comparing the intellectual histories and then also points about how to. So always trying to offer what I think could be a recipe or a manual, which people can take and embrace or rip up depending on, you know, their commitments and orientations and views. But I feel like that is what I'm saying. There needs to be step 2, which is then that we historicize the public discussion and also understand the point about mediatization. That's something I didn't get to say, is this whole pre-print publication thing. The media has often taken up this research, which has not undergone proper peer review, some of which is really wacky and far out there. So for example, at one point people were saying, well, tobacco can help combat COVID-19, or there was the stuff about hydrochloroquine. So there are pitfalls to sort of half-baked, or I don't want to say half-baked, but sometimes the media misrepresents the persuasiveness of a particular study, its statistical nature, and the extent to which it enjoys scientific authority. So I think, Carolyn, I'm delighted by what you and Carla say, because again, I'm trying to set down an agenda with all of your input as colleagues.
Fantastic. Mandisa, there are quite a few comments. Andile, Haley, and Alicia all have made some comments. Unfortunately, we have run out of time. As you can see, that there's from the brief discussion we had, there's a lot of interest and a lot of questions and comments. Unfortunately, we can't address all of them. But again, thank you so much for sharing your work. Do you want to quickly respond to any of the comments? I don't know.
Okay, I need to go through all of these in a great amount of detail. But in terms of Haley's question around the 4th industrial revolution, that is exactly kind of one of the things I'm trying to consider, is life at different scales. So the virus as part of genetic material, the vaccine as containing parts of genetic material, then how that interacts with the actual body, like the physiology, and then how we interact in society and how all those different scales work together. And it is clearly the case that artificial intelligence has greatly influenced the conduct of biological research with biomedical applications. But I can't really say, because crystal ball, where it all might go. But I know that like high throughput processing mechanisms to uncover new biologics and also small molecule drugs have been very important, but I can't really say what the future of all of this holds. But one key thing I'm worried about is this limited public understanding of biotech and also of computational science and the way the two come together. And I think that might also be linked to various so-called pseudoscientific understandings of the disease and the vaccine.
Thanks, Mandisa. Excellent paper, as you can understand from the very lively discussion. Thanks everyone for participating. Next week we have Shamil, so please join us again.